Chapter 19. The transport station was small, less than a handful of terminals in total. But we didn't live in a major city, so it only needed to connect to a few other nearby cities and the central transport station of the United States in Denver, Colorado. There were 5 major hubs in the interior of the country, as well as 4 international ones on the coasts. I would be traveling through one of each on my trip. Aaron pulled up along the passenger drop-off curb. I looked to him, wondering if there was something I should say, but not sure what it could be. I felt sad, anxious, excited, shocked, and pretty much in complete disbelief that this was actually happening, that I was about to go across the world. Aaron must have understood, because he placed his hand on my arm and smiled encouragingly at me. "It'll be great. You'll see." "So says the guy who travels out of country every year," I replied, using humor to try to ease my anxiety levels. "That's right. So obviously I know what I'm talking about." He winked at me, and I chuckled nervously. I climbed out of the car and got my 2 travel bags from the back seat. "I'll call you when I can," I told him, crouching over to look through the rolled-down passenger side window. "Just remember the time difference and don't wake me up at 4 in the morning, okay?" "I will definitely do that now," I grinned. "Thanks for the ride, and thanks for looking after my cats." "No problem." He smiled back and waved at me before pulling out. I watched him for a moment while I took a steadying breath, then turned towards the station doors. In that moment, I felt like anything and everything could happen next. The station wasn't bustling with people, but it wasn't a ghost town either. Early evening was usually busier than morning at all transports, since more people traveled across the Pacific Ocean than the Atlantic, which was the other reason I'd chosen a later travel time. I hoped to avoid a lot of the congestion at the major stations I was going to pass through on my way to Berlin. There are 6 check-in stations inside the doors, all automated, but monitored by someone who would answer questions or help with any technical problems travelers might have. There were also several booths where you could book a trip on the spot if you needed to, or change the one you already had scheduled, but I didn't need to worry about that. I went over to the check-in station and placed my bags on the luggage scale, then stepped onto a scale in front of the kiosk. A large check-in button was displayed on the screen in front of me. Touching it gave me a screen requesting identification. Various forms were listed, but I had already sent a virtual scan of my fingerprint in with my ticket order, so I simply placed my palm on the screen for it to verify. It quickly located my information and asked me to double-check my purchase. I did, and it printed out my transport ticket. There were 5 ID tags on it, one for each of the transport stations I would be traveling through, as well as a barcode that would identify how much my bags and myself weighed. The latter was to try to prevent people from smuggling something or another on between stations. There was some kind of tolerance for souvenirs bought and food eaten, I was sure. I got in line for the security check. Of course, that was always where the congestion would be greatest, but in my small city, and at half an hour to midnight, there was hardly anyone else in line. I quickly reached the MEM scanners, and they had me place my bags on one while I stepped into another. A 3-second scan of the Magicus fields around me and my luggage revealed no contraband, and they waved me through. The seating around the terminal to Denver took up almost an entire side of the transport wing, and was actually decently crowded with at least 24 other people. The other 4 transports were nearly barren of life. Not many people needed to travel in-state at midnight, apparently. I found a seat near the transport and sat down. Pulling out my ticket again, I checked the details of my trip. The transport to Denver would connect at 1:15 midnight. From there, I would go almost immediately to Orlando, Florida, then out of the country entirely to Brasilia, the capital of Brazil, well over 5,000 miles away and 4 hours into the future. I would be there in just under an hour and a half of leaving my hometown. A whole other continent. I took a deep breath and tried to think relaxing thoughts. From Brasilia, I would go to São Luís. And finally, there's a special transport set up from São Luís directly to the school. There would, of course, be another local station in the city somewhere, but I was impressed that the school had managed to get its own personal line. It was that connection around which I'd had to organize the rest of my trip, as there were only a limited number of arrival transports to the school. I put my ticket back in my pocket and looked around the room again. I thought I recognized someone coming in from the security stations, looked closer, and realized it was a girl from my European Portuguese class from the previous term. I glanced quickly around at the rest of the people to see if there was anyone else I knew, but they were all strangers. The gal, whose name I couldn't remember for the life of me, paused when she approached the terminal and glanced around. I didn't know if she was looking for someone in particular, But when she spotted me, her eyebrows shot up and she came over, grinning. "Hi," she greeted brightly. Hi," I said, somewhat taken aback. "You're from my Portuguese class last term, right?" "Yeah," I said, smiling. "I recognized you from there too. I'm Zoe." "I'm Tiffany," she answered, taking a seat next to me. "You're going on the study abroad trip?" "Yeah, I've never been out of the country before." "You've been on transports though, right?" "Yeah," I said again. Oh God, I sound like a broken record. "I've used them a few times to visit family." Tiffany nodded. "This is my second time doing a study abroad." "Wow," I said, honestly impressed. "What are you studying?" "Performance art." I frowned. "And you're going to Brazil?" She laughed at my confused look. "Why not? I'm sure I can get the locals to teach me some stuff the school can't. Tribal dances or something." I huffed. "They are a civilized people down there, you know." "Yeah, but maybe we'll meet some Yedramora," she whispered conspiratorially. I shook my head. "I wish, but probably not." I was surprised as the words came out of my mouth, and even more surprised that I actually meant them. Despite all the fear of the Yedramor, deep inside I thought it would be exciting to actually meet some in their native home. She shrugged. "You never know. So, what are you studying?" "Linguistics and world literature." "That's an odd combination." It was my turn to shrug. "Yeah, but it's interesting, and it gives me a lot of options for a career." She mused. "I suppose. How many languages do you know?" I hesitated. "Speak fluently, understand, or have taken in school." "All of the above," she grinned. "English, Norwegian, and Spanish are the three I'm fluent in. Norwegian also means I understand a decent bit of Swedish and Danish. I took one term each of Italian, French, and of course, European Portuguese. I'm taking Brazilian Portuguese this term." She nodded, impressed, and I continued. "I can understand a bit of spoken Japanese and Arabic, though my reading, writing, and speaking skills need serious help. And I also know more Shakespeare and Old English than I knew existed 2 years ago. I don't know if that counts, though." She chuckled. "Why not? It's not like just anybody can pick up the original Shakespeare and understand it. So why are you going to Brazil?" We continued to talk together about our studies and what we were looking forward to on the trip until our transport connected to Denver 20 minutes later. I pulled out my ticket and checked the number next to the location ID for Denver. 19. The operator called out number 1. The first person stepped up to the pad and showed him the ticket. The operator scanned the weight barcode and checked it against his scale, nodding. Then he pressed a series of buttons and the man disappeared. A moment later, someone else reappeared on the platform. That was how transports efficiently moved a large number of people around, by swapping 2 people between connected transports so they each arrived at their destination simultaneously. The new arrival stepped forward and went around the back side of the machine, heading towards the front doors. The operator called number 2, and the next person stepped up. This process continued only half a dozen times before people stopped coming in from Denver, and we were allowed to all file on uninterrupted. I felt my insides wriggle around as I showed my ticket to the operator. I glanced back at Tiffany as the operator checked my numbers, and Tiffany gave me a thumbs up. "Close your eyes," he told me as he began pressing buttons. I did, my hands squeezing anxiously around the handles of my bags. The darkness of my closed eyes went even darker. I felt disembodied for just a moment and an infinite amount of time at the same time. Suddenly, I was back in my body, on a pad, and someone, a woman's voice this time, was saying, "Please step off." I opened my eyes and walked forward around the back side of a different operator at a different transport station, my 2 luggage bags rolling along beside me. When I was safely in the seating area again, I stopped to look around. The terminal was at least 3 times larger here than in my hometown. A sign hanging from the middle of the room listed the transports and their terminals. "Hello again, Zoe." I turned to see Tiffany walking towards me. "Hey, it looks like the terminal to Orlando is in the same zone as Denver?" I half asked, half said. Tiffany nodded. "They keep all the major hubs in the same zone. I think it's this way." She pointed further down, what was an exceedingly long wing compared to the one I'd just arrived from. I nodded, and we made our way over to a decently busy terminal waiting area. Most people were seated, though there were a couple of small groups standing around and chatting. "So, I have number 53 this time," I said. 62 for me," Tiffany read her ticket. We took a couple seats and waited the 10 minutes until the terminals connected, then another 10 or so while the 50-odd people ahead of us took their turns first. This time, there were also people arriving every time someone left. Not a surprise, considering we were connecting between major hubs now. Eventually, my turn came and I repeated the same process as earlier. Show ticket, close eyes, float in nothingness, emerge in a new station, exit behind the operator. I checked the board for my next gate and glanced at the clock at the top. "Where's our next stop?" Tiffany asked, coming up behind me. I looked at the board again. "Zone D, and we're in B now. Do you know how to get to D? We have about 10 minutes until our next connection." Tiffany stepped forward a few places and turned around to look at the back of the board. "Looks like we take the corridors around that way," she said, pointing to her right. I stepped up beside her to see what she was looking at. A map of the transport station was displayed on the back of the terminal list. Smart. We didn't really need one of those in the small, one-wing stations I was used to. "Well, let's get going," I said. As we speed walked down the hallways, Tiffany muttered to herself, "They sure cut this a little close, didn't they?" "I'm sure it'll be fine. They won't deny us transport if we're late, only if they close the connection before we get there." Then, hesitatingly, I added, "Right?" "Right," Tiffany confirmed. When we found our transport terminal to Brasilia, I noticed a group of 6 people I'd seen in the last station. Tiffany recognized them too. She walked up to them while I hung back a little. Walking up to one person I sort of knew from class was one thing. Walking up to a group of strangers was something completely different. "Hi," she said cheerfully. "I saw you in Denver. Are you going to Brazil?" One of the girls looked at her oddly. A boy answered sarcastically, "No, we're just here for the amazing cuisine." "Oh, well, I hear the buffet in Zone F serves some excellent sushi." "I'm allergic to fish," he said. "All the more reason to try it," Tiffany replied brightly. A couple of his friends laughed. The first gal who'd looked at her spoke up. "I'm Leona. That jackass is Kristoff." She smiled and continued listing names, but I forgot all the others except Rosemary almost immediately. "I'm Tiffany," my new friend told her. She hooked her thumb in my direction. "That's Zoe. We're heading to Belém for the study abroad program." Leona nodded. "So are we." Tiffany beamed and motioned me to come closer. Later, when I was able to pull her aside, I asked her how she was able to just walk up to a group of strange peoples and strike up a conversation like that. "Performing arts, remember? Making people like me is what I do." She winked at me. We chatted with a group of 4 guys and 2 girls until our transport connected. Okay, Tiffany chatted, and mostly with Leona. I stood next to her and tried not to say something stupid. "Transport to Brasilia connected," said a voice over the intercom. I'd been so busy meeting new people and talking with potential friends that I'd forgotten until that point that this transport was going to be the one that took me out of the country and into another hemisphere. Tiffany noticed my change in attitude as that realization hit me. "Are you okay?" I took deep breaths. "Yeah, just nervous, anxious, excited." "Why?" She looked genuinely confused. "It's my first time leaving the country," I reminded her. "I've wanted to travel the world as long as I can remember. That's why I'm studying languages and literature, so I can travel the world for a job. But this is the first time I'm actually doing it." Tiffany put a reassuring hand on my arm. "It's an exciting adventure, right?" I just nodded wordlessly. "Just breathe," she told me. "Right now, it's just another transport, then 2 more. Don't stress about it yet. Let it all sink in later, after you're settled in the dorms." I looked at her in bewilderment. "How do you just not stress?" She smiled. "By only thinking 1 step ahead at a time. Believe me, I was probably just as wound up as you my first time overseas, and I almost wore myself out over it. Yes, it's exciting. Yes, it'll be a grand experience. But let it come as it will. You already have enough to worry about, trying to adjust to the time difference." "It's just 4 hours." "But 4 hours is a lot when you consider what time you usually sleep and eat." "That's what Aaron said," I mumbled. "You think that's bad? Try moving ahead 8 hours. When I went to Spain to study abroad, I was messed up for a week trying to adjust to the time change. That's an entire half a day difference." I laughed, then apologized. "Sorry." She smiled back. It's all good. I was a wreck at the time, but I can laugh about it now too. And it made you forget all about your anxiety. I paused, taking a mental inventory of my body. I guess some, I agreed. Good. Now, one step at a time, starting with the one up to the transport. I took a deep breath and stepped into line. A minute later, my number was called and I showed the operator my ticket. She nodded and pressed her buttons. I closed my eyes as the world disappeared.